I'd like to thank our lecture sponsors tonight, the Gazette newspapers and the Courtyard Marriott. So tonight, I am very pleased and honored to welcome a dear friend and colleague of mine of 20 years, Mr. Dave Bader. Dave tonight will discuss lessons learned from the conservation efforts aimed at protecting the Vaquita porpoise and how we might apply these to other endangered species. Particularly tonight, Dave will be talking about Argentina's Franciscana dolphin and China's Yangtze finless porpoise. Dave is the Aquarium's Director of Education Extraordinaire, I might add to that. In this role, he develops and manages school and public programs. He also focuses on exhibit interpretation and training and grant development for the education departments. He has a bachelor's degree in marine biology from the University of California in Santa Cruz and a master's degree in biology with an emphasis in educational media design from the University of California in Irvine. In 2015, Dave joined the AZA, or the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, Vaquita SAFE. That is, SAFE stands for Saving Animals From Extinction program. And today, he serves as its lead coordinator. In 2019, Dave traveled to workshops on conservation in Argentina and China to share his knowledge and experience. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dave Bader.
Wow, thank you. I appreciate everybody coming tonight to hear my story, to hear the story of a few different species and a few different communities of people. And what I'm going to take you through right now is sort of a journey that I've been on over the last 4 years to engage, I think, really deeply in thought, at least, in how conservation should take place. And starting from a place of being really an engagement person. You know, I started, this is my first job out of college here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. I worked in the education department and, you know, continued to get new jobs and new promotions as those came up, and eventually now as the director of education. And throughout that experience, my first role in here was to, you know, get in front of people and to share my passion about marine life, you know, just because it's cool. You know, the animals that we have in these exhibits are cool. But more recently, my focus has shifted into not just that these animals are cool, but these are animals that are cool and they're in some trouble. And we absolutely have it in our capacity to protect wildlife, to preserve biodiversity. But some of the things that I've learned in the last few years is that our focus is off a little bit, I think. And the way that we go about conservation could be improved, and we could preserve biodiversity much better if we were to learn our lessons of the past and apply those lessons to the future. So today, I hope to take you through kind of not just the story of people in place and of different species, but also sort of the story of the history of my thoughts on conservation and how I feel like we could do a better job by focusing just a little bit differently on how we approach conservation action. So today we're going to talk about, like Sandy said, 3 different species in particular. And we'll start, well, maybe 4 different species. We'll start with the beginning. How does that sound? We're going to talk about Vaquita a little bit today, but we're going to start with recognition that we're all connected. Communities are connected globally, and it's not just recently that these global connections have taken place. With the story of the Vaquita, it doesn't start in 2015 with the ban of Gillnets or in the mid-2000s with illegal totuaba poaching. The story of Vaquita starts at the turn of the century. It starts with the establishment of an export fishery for a fish called the totuaba, which you can see pictured here, for a specific product. It's swim bladder, dried and sold primarily in China. It's swim bladder. It's a dried product, so at that time it could be dried and shipped and preserved in that way. But it's important to recognize that the 3 fishing communities of the Upper Gulf of California established at this time as an export community. It's already globally connected, and we haven't invented iPhones yet. So this is where we start, and we start in this place. But we have to recognize that communities don't stay static. They continue to evolve and grow over time. And so the fishing communities of the Upper Gulf, they evolve and grow as well. So the original technologies, when the resources were plentiful, were simple. Spears, hooks, lines. Then the resource became more diminished, less totoaba. So we have to seek with more effort to catch the same amount of animals. And we see this across different fisheries. New technologies are applied to increase the yield of the resource as that resource is diminishing. And eventually we see the collapse of the totoaba fishery, but that totoaba fishery goes away, but fishing doesn't end in the Upper Gulf. Those communities are established, and the resources are abundant in this space. Instead of stopping and moving away, they switch. They move into a new resource, and it's again another export resource. It's primarily shrimp, and that shrimp comes to California mostly, and in the Southwest. The way that fishing happens, though, in the space is with gillnets. So this is the technology that's probably applied around 1940, around World War II. Plastics come onto the scene, and the use of plastics in monofilament fishing line, and through a new technology to add to fishing, which is highly efficient, the use of gillnets. And they actually gillnet for shrimp in the Upper Gulf. But remember, communities grow along with these resources, and they're globally connected. So as we think about our conservation issues, we think about the totoaba, we think about the vaquita, we can't think of those in isolation. We have to think about those connected with the people in that space, the people who are utilizing the resource and who have grown in that space, whose communities have developed in and around that space based on the resources that they're taking from the sea, providing them a livelihood and prosperity, but sharing that prosperity with the world, to us here in Southern California through fisheries products, mainly shrimp, or to China earlier on through totoaba ma. So families of people, families of animals, that were all interconnected. But the use of gillnets is a challenge. It's a fishery that, if not well regulated, is so highly efficient at pulling resource out of the ocean that it can really, really lead to decimation of resources. The totoaba caught with gillnets, after being caught with hook and line and spear, the gillnet is what really caused the totoaba population to crash. It's an endangered species itself. But then we can look and see what happened to the vaquita alongside. No matter what kind of gillnet is out in the water, vaquitas really can't handle it. So gillnets that are set for sierra, which is a kind of fish, or shark, or totoaba, or shrimp, all of those gillnets will entangle vaquita, and the vaquita will drown. Right about 1997 is when a few Mexican researchers start to do some research on vaquita, and they start to recognize really quickly that they're listening for vaquita in the water, and they're hearing fewer and fewer vaquita. We see the population, halving every time we do another survey. And today the population of vaquita probably is around 9. Very few vaquita left in the world. So this is what's happening. So what do we want? We want to see a Gillnet ban. So in 2015, a Gillnet ban was enacted in the space. And myself, this is when I joined the AZA SAFE, and this is when I joined the conservation effort for vaquita, recognizing that at that time there were 100 vaquita left, then 60, and recognizing that a species was going extinct. It's a marine species, and we need to do something to share with people the story of vaquita. We need to do something so that people know a marine species is going extinct, and aquariums are seemingly, to me, the place where this information needs to come out. So in 2015, President of Mexico and the President of the United States get together, and they talk about vaquita, which is amazing. And they come out of that meeting, which probably talked about a lot of things, with a comprehensive Gillnet ban for the entire range of the vaquita. This was the victory that we wanted. This was the answer to Vaquita. No more gillnets, Vaquita are saved. Then I went to San Felipe in 2016, and this is what I found in San Felipe. 90% of the economy in the Upper Gulf is fishing. Almost all of the fishing that occurs in the space is with gillnets. So a gillnet ban in the space with very little alternative for fishermen to have a different living led to some serious declines in the social network and fabric of the communities of that Upper Gulf. This is a shrimp packing plant, completely empty. All of the people that would have been working in this space, and one thing to recognize is that only men fish on the water in Mexico. Women don't go on fishing pongas in Mexico. So when we see a loss of jobs in the space, when we lose the shrimp, we also lose the shrimp packers. And that's a job that women could have had in this space as well. So we have 50% of the population now who is struggling for jobs that don't exist anymore, plus all of the men now. So pretty much nobody has a job anymore. It was all connected with that fishing. Clearly, there's going to be a problem. And there was. In the Upper Gulf, we see terrible social problems. Prior to the really crazy social problems we're seeing right now with poaching, but prior to that, we see alcoholism. We see food banks being utilized where they weren't before. We see anxiety, depression where it didn't exist really before. These are all social issues that are a direct result of the conservation gain that we celebrated so broadly. Because we didn't really consider the social ramifications of the conservation action that we wanted to take. We recognized that there was one way to solve the problem, and it was through this regulation, and we were going to ban gillnets, and that was going to save the Vaquita. But the people in the space now have to live with these social problems that they have now. They have to figure out how to make a living on their own without the resources that they once had. And so what's going to happen in this situation where people want to provide for their families? They want food, they want a house, they want education for their children, not great, huge riches, and it's not available to them. What's going to happen? You don't have the support of the community in that space. And I think that is a direct result for seeing a lot of the poaching and a lot of the illegal activities that we see in the Upper Gulf right now, because people just don't have a choice. Thinking about this too, we need to recognize that working with people, for their prosperity is also sustainable. We have to recognize that we have limited resources as conservationists, and we're not going to be there forever. The people of San Felipe, the people of the Upper Gulf, they live there. They're not leaving there, and they'll be there generation after generation after generation. The solution has to be there, and that's where our work needs to be as well. So while we were spending time thinking about regulations and banning gillnets, we should have been sitting down with people. So when we think about conservation, when we think about what conservation looks like, I think we probably envision people in Land Rover Jeeps driving across the Serengeti with dart guns, right? And they're collaring leopards or whatever it might be and tracking them with those little beepy things that somehow help you find a leopard, right? And that's what conservation looks like. It's very hands-on with the animals. It's building fences. It's park rangers providing protection for the animals that are there. It's maybe the iconic picture of somebody standing next to a rhinoceros with a rifle, right, protecting that rhinoceros from a poacher. We rarely see, conservation happening with people sitting down at a table, talking to each other, working out their problems together. This is us in that 2016 trip to San Felipe, meeting with one of the local fishermen. That's him right here and his wife, to really understand the critical issues. This guy right here, he's a conservation fisherman. He was actually working with the scientists to develop alternative gear strategies, alternative livelihoods. When we sat down and talked to him, we asked the question, what would you want to do? he would rather go back to gillnet fishing. You know, he's working towards a different problem, but the problems were less and the life was easier when gillnet fishing was allowed. They had a better life prior to gillnet fishing. So it's still a challenge. Even for the people who are making the right choices, that choice is still a tough one to live with. This guy over here, he owns Rositas. This is the restaurant we're sitting in. And he has been a staunch supporter of improving the ecology of the Upper Gulf in San Felipe. He's single-handedly helped to clean up the beach in San Felipe, which is still a tourist place, picking up trash there on his lunch, and really working for and with the community. Very ecologically minded person. We also met another restaurateur who was similarly, not against the conservation, but at the same time didn't really believe that the conservation would work, that it wouldn't last, that it would never take, that the government would never support it, and eventually people would walk away from it. So all sorts of different ideas and different people in the space and how they feel about conservation for the Vaquita and for the Upper Gulf. We need to really focus on the root cause of conservation problems and focus on the people who are expert at dealing with people. What we find too often, and in my work and through this process, I look across the conservation landscape and I see biologists. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, we need biologists. But the decisions that the biologists are making are ones about people, about behavior of people. Our conservation problem lives there, and yet it's biologists who are making those decisions. There are scientists who work in fields to understand how people think and how to change behavior. The social science is what we need to focus on. It's not easy. It takes a long time. We need to understand it. There are experts, probably not enough of them, but we need to employ them. So one of the things that I've said a lot in the last 4 years is if you look around the room in your conservation program and you don't see a social scientist, then your conservation program and your conservation plan is not complete. And if that social scientist is in the room but not at the head of the table, is not one of the leadership cohort of your conservation plan, then your conservation plan is probably not complete. When we look at conservation, where's our focus? Where's our attention? When you can Google it now if you get bored. Google Vaquita, and what you're going to find is the story of cartel fishermen, cartels working with poachers to harvest totuaba, to harvest their swim bladders, to send to China for medicinal purposes. And that's pretty much all the story you're ever going to hear. If you watch the movie Sea of Shadows, that's the story that they tell. It's one narrative, and it's the narrative of the last 10 years. It's not the full story. It doesn't tell the story of how that fishery was developed. It doesn't tell the story of how the exports from shrimp and finfish to the United States were also part of the problem in the decline of Vaquita. It doesn't tell the complex stories that are so integral to really understanding the conservation problems. And we tend to focus then on species as animal people. I'm a marine biologist, right? I'm going to focus on animals. I think they're cool. But I'm coming into the recognition that this is where the work lies, in getting with these people to really figure out the answers to our problems. That's where we need to do a better job. Trust from the people within those communities is what's important. This is San Felipe. It is a beautiful place. I would normally recommend you check it out. I think right now you would be fine. It's a place that people go to vacation a lot. But this is a place that's the epicenter right now also for totuaba, poaching, and some activity that's illegal from cartels. So I can't wholly endorse visiting San Felipe right now. Although there is a tourist economy in this space, and I hope that one day we all can go down to visit San Felipe, because it is absolutely a a beautiful place in the world. It's 10,000 people living in the middle of the desert, and the stretches of beaches are just amazing. And at night, especially on a new moon, with only so many people there, you can see absolutely every star. It's one of the most incredible places that I've ever visited, and I hope to return. I wanted just to share that some of the insights that I have and some of the information I'm sharing is part of a research project from Tara Whitty and Samantha Young, who went down to San Felipe and interviewed the community to understand the community's thoughts, ideas, and feelings about conservation efforts for the vaquita. I think it's critical because this is the kind of work that we need to build upon to make sure that this isn't the one-off that happens every now and then, but this is the core of what conservation looks like. We need to make sure that we're working with the fishermen, with the community, to build trust, to build trust while we're building our understanding. These things can happen together. They don't have to happen separately. We need to think about, and I forgot to define, CBCE, community-based conservation engagement. The term that we need to think about and have be part of our language in thinking about conservation is how are we engaging with and for communities to support the change that we want to see. We need to look at the root cause because the animals are fine by themselves. The problem comes when people come along, right? So people are there. We need to think about sustainability and effective and quality conservation. We need to look at how well are we doing at protecting the species that we're seeking to conserve and the biodiversity we want to preserve. Where are the metrics for those things? If you look around the world, things are not as good as they could be. Maybe it's because our efforts might need to shift a little bit. We might need to change the way we go about things. We need to think about engaging with stakeholders first. Am I driving this home enough? We need to talk to people, listen to people, understand people. They determine the long-term success of what's going to happen within a conservation problem. We need to move from people to be, passive recipients of information to active participants in conservation. So it's not enough to go into a community and educate people on the conservation problem that's around. You need to work with the community so that that community feels agency in making the change, or self-efficacy, and maybe transitioning to agency in making the change that we want to see. And if it doesn't work, and it's likely not to, we can't give up. Can't walk away. People are complicated. I guarantee the first time that we try to do something within a community for a new species is probably not going to work. The list of failures is a lot bigger than the list of successes. But if we use those failures to define us, to say it's not working, we're going to give up, then we're giving up on conservation. We can't give up on people. We have to keep at it because people are complicated. So what should we do differently? Well, we do a whole lot of talking. We do not a whole lot of listening. To really engage with the community, to build trust, you have to listen. You have to come in without an agenda. You have an agenda, but don't come in with that agenda. Come in to build trust, to understand the community, to understand the people, and not to understand their deficits, but to understand the knowledge that they can bring, the assets that they can bring to the conservation problem. To think about what is the aspiration for that community. I can guarantee the aspirations for the community are not to cause the vaquita to go extinct. It's not to cause degradation of the environment. Their aspirations are going to be our aspirations, versions of, right? General prosperity. So how can we align? Where are the synergies where we can work towards providing what people want, their aspirations, and how that connects with preservation of biodiversity? And that's where we're going to find the sweet spot. So thinking about our goals. This is what conservation typically looks like. We gather more biological knowledge, and by we, it probably means, people who look like me, academics, people from institutions in North America or Europe who go to foreign countries and gather more information about the animals that live there. And then from that biological knowledge of understanding the ranges and the food items and the, all of that kind of stuff, we say, okay, these are the laws that we need to put in place to preserve the species. And then when that doesn't work, we think about, well, that's not working. Maybe we need to bring them into captive care because it's not working out in the field. That's how we typically go about it. But maybe shifting, we think about it a little bit differently. We think about community-based conservation engagement, about providing sustainable communities and prosperous communities. And then through that, we can start to build the biological knowledge, but who's doing that? Maybe it's the communities that are supporting building their own understanding of what their base knowledge is of their own environment, of the ecology, of the ecosystems. Then we need to take a serious look at captive care. It's a big no-no. People do not want to do this. There's taboos around this everywhere. But if we're serious about preserving biodiversity, we need to think about all the tools in the tool chest. And captive care is one of those things that we have to consider if we're serious about preserving biodiversity. Then maybe we start thinking about regulations that work with communities, that they're in support of because they understand how it's going to benefit them and the aspirations that they have. And we also think about what are some of the ways that we might define different livelihoods, either through different fisheries or different means of providing support for families. All of these things together, not one before the other, but thinking about them holistically and how they interconnect, is how we should think about conservation. We're better when we're all working together. There are people in their own camps right now. There's the in situ people. The people in situ means in environment. The people who are working to gain more biological understanding, to set up reserves, to clean up the environment, but hands off from the animals, right? And that's the work that they do. And they work wholly separately from the people who think about, well, how do we manage the care of these animals? Should we think about captive care? Should we put a reserve population so that if something goes wrong in the wild because people are encroaching on all sides, that we make sure we have a population that's resilient to those changes? Those people don't talk to each other and they don't trust each other. So where we don't trust the communities, often don't trust the conservationists often don't trust each other. They're not working together. We need to work together. And we need to work together not just for the preservation of species, but for the prosperity of people. Those are the things that we need to think of together. So those are the base lessons learned. And now we think about, this is what I've learned from Vaquita. How do we apply these now to other species? So I'm going to tell you a little bit more now about the Yangtze finless porpoise and the Franciscana dolphin. So the first thing is, we had a great time in Nuremberg, Germany in December 2018. I participated in a project called Vaquita CPR, and Vaquita CPR was an effort by a number of world experts in ex situ care, captive care of animals, to try to rescue the remaining few vaquita and bring them into human care. That was not a success. It ended in failure. It ended tragically in the death of a vaquita. We waited too long. And so from that effort, from those people, we got back together. I was lucky enough, through my engagement with the ACA, to participate in Vaquita CPR and meet some really amazing people. And we went to Germany with this guy right over here. This is Lorenzo von Pearson, who is a force of nature. I think I nearly chipped a tooth when he hugged me when I got off the plane in Argentina the other day. That's his personality, very big. So he brought all of these people to Nuremberg to talk about conservation, to think about how we might do better. The group, we call ourselves ESOCC, or Ex Situ Options for Cetacean Conservation, because we went into this meeting thinking about how do we engage in ex situ conservation, captive care conservation, earlier in the process. That was the original idea for the meeting. But through that meeting, we came up with a different idea. You got people together, they all talked, great things happen. This is what we came up with. The IUCN, which is the International Body for Conservation of Nature, that's not the acronym, but that's what they do. They have a plan. It's called the One Procha Plan. And what that plan says is, you guys suck. You're in the in situ camp, you're in the ex situ camp, you're not talking to people. That's not best practice. We need to think about one continuum of care, of conservation. And that all has to be integrated. We need to think about all of those things because they're all essential for conservation. Oh, and by the way, stakeholder engagement is important too. That's in there. We forget about it a lot, but I'm there to remind them each time. But that's the thing we came up with. And actually, I'll go back. We also met this guy right here. His name is Wang Ding, and he is from China, working on the Yangtze River on both the conservation for the Baiji dolphin and for the Finless porpoise. And we learned from him that they've been doing some amazing work on ex situ management, captive care of Finless porpoise, and they've been really successful. So from that, we said we should look at this. We should engage to see whether what they're doing in China could be what we do across the board for species, to have that as an option for their conservation. So we did. We went to Wuhan, China. Yes, to Wuhan, China, that China. Now everybody knows where I went. I got back in November. We're all good. The conservationists that participated with us, also good. Oh, there I am. So we met in China to learn more about two species, really. The Baiji river dolphin, which went extinct. It's sadly not there. 2008 declared extinct. But in that same process, it was recognized that the Yangtze finless porpoise was drastically declining. Its population was headed in the same direction as the Baiji and as the Vaquita, and something needed to be done. And Wang Ding and his colleagues at the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation, working within China, have developed some really interesting ways of preserving biodiversity for the species, working hand in hand. This is the finless porpoise. This is what it looks like in the wild. So when you see them in the wild, they're just a little lump. Sometimes you get a big splash. One of the really amazing things, so this was my first trip to China. This all behind here, these are brand new planted trees in neat rows. We drove out of the city of Wuhan into the rural areas to find the conservation areas for the finless porpoise. And all along the way, trees are planted everywhere. There must be billions of trees being planted in China right now. So you can see a deep commitment now in China to shifting towards a more conservation-minded approach to the land and the resources that they have. Okay, this is my iPhone video of finless porpoise. It's not a Loch Ness monster. It does look like a Loch Ness, right? You saw that one, right? The little ripples, that's the Loch Ness. No, it's not Loch Ness, it's the Yangtze finless porpoise. Did you know that they lived in Loch Ness? So along the Yangtze River, which runs right through the middle of China, it's one of the largest rivers in the world, there are 400 million people in China that live along this river. Now, consider the United States, 300 million people-ish. Take everybody in the United States and push them right up against the Mississippi River. So that's kind of the scale of the amount of people that we're talking about and the impact on the resource that's there. It's incredible, right? They've set up these several different conservation areas. The video you saw was from, I'm not really going to try to pronounce this, Tianzhu Oxbow. There you go, I tried it. That's where we saw those porpoise. So what's happening in that space? Well, they've set up this series of Oxbow reserves. So when a river hits a flat piece of land, it starts to meander, making these kind of U-shaped bends. Those are called oxbows. And every now and then the river, by people or by nature, will straighten out, leaving these horseshoe-shaped lakes on either side of the river. We call those oxbow lakes. In China, they've created reserves out of these oxbows. And Wang Ding and his crew from the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation have picked up finless porpoise from the river and placed them into these oxbow lakes. Now, in these spaces, it's technically not totally wild. They are managed, they are protected, but pretty much they pick them up, they put them in the lake, and then they're hands off after that. They are allowed to do what they do, and what they do is live pretty happily, and they breed, and their populations are growing. So it's this idea of, can we find a semi-natural environment where we can take an animal that's critically endangered, whose population is declining, and can we put them in a space that we can monitor a little bit more closely, that closely mimics the natural environment that they live in, but we can use those as reserve populations to preserve biodiversity and keep an animal from going extinct. They're doing amazing things in China, really charging forward, probably faster than the researchers I was working with are comfortable with, but they're moving forward at a pace of expanding this conservation effort so that they can preserve the finless porpoise and have that as their resource on the Yangtze River. But when you do that, when you create a conservation area and you preserve a space for a species, you're preserving an ecosystem. People argue against single species conservation, and I agree with them. We should not save single species because things need to eat. And so there has to be food, there has to be an ecosystem, there has to be environment. But single species are things we can wrap our brains around and we can understand them. And if we preserve those single species, especially if they're top of the food chain predators, then we preserve the ecosystems around them. And in these spaces, we saw these Piers-David's deer. They were critically endangered, and now they're thriving in these oxbow preserves. Birds, I'll just say birds. Outside of the conservation areas in China, I really didn't see any birds. Wuhan, city of 14 million people, there really are no pigeons. Driving down the road, there really are no birds flying around. In these reserve spaces, there are birds. That's because in China, with so many people with so little resource, many of these birds were either competing with farmers for fish ponds or for grains, and so they were eliminated because of that. That the wildlife sort of, I'm going to do air quotes, knows where those preserved spaces are, and they can thrive in them. Within that space, we see breeding. But I said China's doing everything. They're breeding in the Oxbow Lake, which is in the background here. They're also breeding them in net pens and having success in that. They're throwing everything at this so that they can understand all of the different things that you might need to understand for the preservation of this species. This is a baby that was born not too long before we got there. I'm calling them little buttbacks. So they got this. Anyways, we'll continue. No one else thought, you guys were the only ones who thought that's funny. Nobody there thought that was funny. So this is another area of the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation. This is a facility that was actually specifically built for the preservation of the Baiji river dolphin, which unfortunately they were never able to establish that captive population. They were never able to rescue a Baiji to bring it into captive care for the preservation. So now they use this space for finless porpoise. Oop. Oh, let me go back. Aren't they cute? That's what they look like in slow motion. Rob, can you help me out? Can you hit play? Oh, here, we'll try it again. There we go. So they're like mini beluga. These ones are probably pretty chunky. Their heads move side to side. They totally were checking us out. They were coming by the windows to look at us, interacting with each other as well. In China, they call them the smiling porpoise as well, and you can see why. This is an animal that's not going to leave us. Because of the efforts of Wang Ding, because of the efforts of the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation, this species is not going to go extinct. Through conservation, through ex situ management, perhaps through one plan approach, because there's in situ work happening in concert with this, we're not going to lose this species. We lost the Baiji, we learned that lesson. We're not going to lose the finless porpoise. So I also traveled to Argentina. There I am. To learn a little bit more about another species. This one is the Franciscana dolphin. The Franciscana dolphin is a dolphin that looks and is related to the river dolphins, but it doesn't live in rivers. It's a coastal marine species. You might have heard of it also as the La Plata River dolphin. It lives from Brazil down into Argentina. And today there's probably about 20,000 Franciscana dolphin. Oh, I should mention that there are about 1,000 Yangtze finless porpoise. And the population in the wild, in the Yangtze River, seems to be stable right now at about 1,000. It's just 2 years since the decline, but it's a shift. Every year there was a decline. Now it's stabilized. So we can cross our fingers with the Yangtze finless porpoise. The Franciscana dolphin has a pretty robust population, but the population is declining. But before we get to declining populations, let's look at some Franciscana dolphin. This is drone footage. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see one in real life, but we can enjoy the footage of them. They live in these really turbid waters, so it looks like beautiful tropical water, but in a moment you're going to notice one kind of dive down, and within 5 feet it kind of disappears. These are dolphins that are not very big. You'll see another picture in a little bit. They're wee little creatures, and they feed on small fishes, mostly about like 3 inches long. They probably dive for about 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes max. Live coastal within a few kilometers of the shoreline. One of the amazing things about these animals is while some have ranges of like 200 kilometers, something like that, there was a tagged animal that never left an area of about 6 kilometers. So a tiny little home range for the species. See there, you can see it just disappears in a second. And the drone's running out of battery. But I wanted to give you a shot. This was Franciscana from Brazil, so you can kind of see where they live and their proximity to the coast. But unfortunately, gillnets are a problem for this species as well. And they're dying at about 1,000 per year. They are entangled in gillnets set by artisanal or small boat fishermen, so people who are living in the subsistence level on the fish they catch, all the way to commercial gillnet fishing that's happening in Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay as well. The good news about the Franciscana is like the Yangtze finless porpoise, they can be handled. One of the things I didn't mention about the Vaquita is when we went to capture Vaquita to try to bring them into captive care, Vaquita, they can't handle the stress of capture. For certain animals, there's a thing called capture myopathy, and the act of capturing the animal puts them into a state where they end up having a heart attack or they end up somehow dying because of it. We can learn more about a species to solve that problem, and for many of the species that we see in zoos today, there was a problem with capture myopathy in the beginning, and now there isn't, and we know how to take care of them. But for a species that we've waited until there were only 15 left or 30 left, you're really put into a position where you can't try to learn more about them, or you're in some really tough decisions that you have to make after that. So thinking about how do we do captive care on a species needs to happen at a time when the population is more robust. There have been tagging studies for Franciscana dolphin. We can see Randy Wells, who's with Chicago Zoological Society, works out of Sarasota, and has done some of the most long-term studies on coastal bottlenose dolphins in Sarasota Bay. I think he's done studies on the same animals for over 40 years. He's supporting the Aquamarina Foundation to learn more about Franciscana dolphins, working with a gentleman called Leo down in Argentina. What they've learned by tagging and releasing Franciscana is that they can survive the handling process. And you can tag an animal and you can track that animal for a long time to realize that it's doing just fine. So Aquamarina is not just tagging and releasing and building a biological understanding of Franciscana, but they're also working with local fishermen, artisanal fishermen, to figure out how best to keep Franciscana from being entangled in gillnets. They're working hand in hand with the communities like they should be for the best possible efforts. But we're at a position now with Franciscana that we need to start thinking about. They're dying at 1,000 a year. There are 20,000 left. There are not too many years left before the Franciscana is in the same position as the Baiji, the Vaquita, and the Yangtze Finless porpoise. What are the actions that we're going to take today to preserve this species? And why are we talking about dolphins? Well, there's a global emergent trend towards the loss of biodiversity in the ocean. We see it not for just the Baiji, the Vaquita, the Yangtze Finless porpoise, the Franciscana dolphin, but we see it for all of these species. Pretty much every coastal marine dolphin, or coastal dolphin, or shallow water dolphin, river dolphins, are facing declines in their population primarily due to gillnet fishing, but other causes as well. But it's not just dolphins. It's not just cetaceans. We see sharks and rays also declining in their populations. Why? All of these animals share the same life history characteristics. They're long-lived, slow-to-reproduce species. Those are the first that are going to have a hard time when their populations decline to bounce back. They're just the beginning, though. We see in gillnet fisheries sea turtles, seabirds, other cetaceans, fishes also being captured, unintended capture, and thrown back into the ocean. We call this bycatch. And it's causing problems all over the world. We need to do a better job of managing our resources, of looking towards working with people to provide prosperity in a way that they can help preserve species all over the world. So thank you. That's the lessons I've learned from my conservation with these 3 species, and I hope you guys have learned a little bit along the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
So we have some time for questions now for Dave. We have a microphone in the back as well. Just raise your hand and we'll come to you. Questions? Yes.
I should mention the reason why we're passing microphone out is there's a live stream right now. So we're also recording and streaming. So if you ask a question today, we want you to use the microphone so that everybody in Internetville can hear you.
So out of curiosity, for the Franciscana dolphin, you say that they are working with the local community. What is the local community doing as far as the gillnets being regulation or reducing catching rates? How are they receiving this whole new approach to conservation?
So it's complicated. So Aquamarina is based in Argentina, and the work that they're doing is initial. So they've worked with local fishermen to put pingers on the nets, and the pingers seem to be doing a good job of keeping Franciscana dolphin out of the gill nets. So that's a possible solution. The pingers themselves, each individual one, costs $50 or something like that. It's not a huge cost, but to the fishermen in that space, they'd never be able to afford that on their own. They could be provided them, but that's an additional step of effort that would need to be taken. Interestingly, though, they work closely with Aquamarina, hand in hand, very cooperatively. Aquamarina leaves, comes back and says, how's it going with the pingers? They're like, oh, you want us to use them all the time? There's still work to be done. And they live in Brazil and Uruguay as well. So there's work to be done in the entirety of its range. No captive care facilities, no rescue rehab facilities in the entirety of that space.
More questions?
Totally confused you or totally covered everything?
I was talking to my associate here a while ago. Your last name is Bader.
Yes.
And RBG, the famous RBG, has the same middle name. Is there any connection there?
Same middle last name?
Well,
yeah, totally. That's my grandma.
well, my middle name is also a last name.
There's a few Baders in every phone book. We're out there. Beware. Some of us do great things.
I think there was
RBG.
another question. Oh, here's one over here.
This might be a yes or no answer. You were talking about the social aspect throughout conservation in general, but
Just a little bit, right?
a little bit. So there's a social aspect, is that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so.
Just wanted to make sure. When you talked about the river dolphin,
See.
it was all ex situ stuff. Was there any social aspect? Because you mentioned a huge population in that area. What did that look like?
Yeah, so with the finless porpoise, I think it's the one you're talking about, right? So there is a comprehensive fishing ban throughout the entirety of the Yangtze River for 10 years starting now, apparently. So there's in situ work happening. There's some NGOs that are working with local fishermen to convert local fishermen to people who are patrolling rivers to report on illegal activities. In China, some of those illegal activities are sand mining. Something I learned, sand is an important component of cement. And in a country like China that's so developing and so rapidly, the need for cement is really high. And so mining of sand is a really lucrative proposition for people. So pulling sand out of the river is a challenge, and there's lots of illegal sand mining that happens. So they're spotting for that. So there is some community work happening in China. I think China's an interesting place. There are things that can happen in China that probably can't happen in other places because of the way that that China works, right? So part of the understanding that we have to take is understanding people and culture, right? And not trying to understand them through our lens, but trying to understand people and culture through their lens. So the work that we do in China has to be from the perspective of the Chinese. And understanding what can and can't happen in those spaces. And we do that by listening, right? So I wish I could tell you more about all of the intricacies of how you work with people in China, but I don't know that. Actually, I'm a marine biologist and an educator. I am not a social scientist. I aspire to be one day, but I can't tell you exactly what we should do other than find those social scientists. I think they are kind of like Sasquatch. I think they exist. I've heard of them. People believe in them. There's some evidence, but I haven't seen them. And I mean that truthfully. I have not seen them. I've seen converted biologists, but I have not seen someone who went to school to be a social scientist for conservation applied in a conservation setting. But that's what we need.
A new career for all of
Yeah.
us. Yes, one more question.
Hi, David.
Hi.
I was just going to say that I work for NOAA, the Restoration Center, and I work with social scientists on a lot of my projects, and I really like what you're saying. In particular, I work on a project that's working on with aircrafts and trying to prevent disturbance to seabirds, and we've been working with social scientists to design our outreach materials and really trying to get at the message correctly. And so interviewing people and like you're talking about trying to refine that message.
Mm-hmm.
So realizing that as scientists, we aren't skilled at that. So trying to reach out to social scientists to help us develop the best message to get our message across. So
Yeah,
it's happening more and more. So.
More and more, right? But even within NOAA, we know that the way that we develop fisheries regulations, I wish we took more of that approach.
Mm-hmm.
The way that we do our regulations has more to do with collecting biological knowledge and then applying a regulation based on that than it is working with local fishermen to really understand how to apply regulations that would be meaningful to them. That happens. I'm not saying that doesn't happen ever, but it is a way that we should go about things sort of strategically. We should be starting at that listening and talking and understanding the needs and aspirations of a community before we get to setting regs and developing, how we're going to handle the situation. But I'm glad to hear it. I know it's happening.
Fortunately, I don't work on the regulated side, so.
Yeah, maybe they will.
But yeah, and also
Hopefully
I was
what
gonna
you do
mention we work in
involves that.
Mexico quite a bit on work with Conservación de las Islas and working with the local community and really wanting to empower scientists in Mexico, nationals. So I think that's really important as well.
What's amazing is that if you want to look for areas of conservation success, I've told you of an area of conservation failure in Mexico, but in Mexico, that's where you'd find the model for things that are happening in the right way, happening within the communities, and it's community-driven responses to conservation problems. The model's there in Mexico. And here in the States with NOAA.
I think we have time for one more question.
Catherine already got her question.
All right.
Livia, you can have a question too.
Thank you, David. You clearly have seen the value and the impact of listening to the community.
See.
Here at the aquarium, I wanted to know, we don't have the Vaquita here to, go out and make kind of that work done and of listening to the community, engaging with them. So with the agency that you have here as the Director of Education and the impact you have within the programs you develop, the exhibits you do, what is the aquarium doing to take that lesson of listening to the community as they are developing programs, developing exhibits, and be more inclusive in the same way that you're saying is important for other communities that are trying to conserve animals?
See how it is? You can call me out. Talking the talk, do I walk the walk? So if you were to look at what we're doing with climate resilience in Long Beach, we are focused on, with the mayor of Long Beach, to help Long Beach become the model of a climate resilient city. And we recognized quite early on that our strategies for doing that were old school. We brought people into a room to tell them all about the challenges that Long Beach is going to face to climate change and everything that they should do about it, right? We were a little bit smarter. We had them workshop, and it was still fun and engaging. But then we had another meeting, and the same 5 people showed up. And then we had another meeting, and the same 5 people showed up. So we recognized really quickly we weren't connecting with the broader communities of Long Beach. We were connecting with the same 5 people every time. Through work that we did through an NSF grant with the New England Aquarium, we developed ourselves professionally. And we've learned a new approach that ties in with the approaches that I've learned through Vaquita. And it's called the Harwood approach. And we've worked to be better at understanding that we need to come in with listening, that we need to apply, that's basically the Harwood slide that you saw a second ago, that we have to listen and understand the aspirations of communities, understand where those values and those goals and those what the community can bring to the situation, and then apply that to now our goals, to find that synergy and to help Long Beach through that process become climate resilient. So we're working on that in that area. How that works from the public that walks in through our space and how we engage, and how do we, like, when we go to a seal and sea lion show and we talk to you about the Vaquita, what do we want you to do, right? What's the public ask? And how do we convert a public ask into, we want you to support communities in San Felipe? We have some work to do on developing those asks, but it's where I'm focused. But if it was easy, it'd been done.
Just show those pictures of that smiling dolphin.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
I think you've really inspired us all to become conservation ambassadors tonight, and you're doing fantastic work. So thank you for leading the way on all these great efforts.
Sandy.
You